Right, I just want to start by thanking everyone for joining us for this evening's event. My name's Emily, and I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's Books. Before we begin, I just want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. One of the many upcoming events we're looking forward to is CBS Sunday morning science correspondent David Pogue in conversation about his timely new book, How to Prepare for Climate Change. That's tomorrow, the 10th. And if you don't already, please do consider following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Tonight, we are so honored to welcome Elizabeth Kolbert and Bill McKibben, both of whom we've had the pleasure of hosting for in-store events previously and hope to welcome again someday. Elizabeth is the author of Field Notes from a Catastrophe, Man, Nature, and Climate Change, and The Sixth Extinction, An Unnatural History, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize. For her work at The New Yorker, where she's a staff writer, she has received 2 National Magazine Awards and the Blake Dodd Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She lives in Williamstown, Massachusetts with her husband and children. In her new book, Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future, she returns to humanity's transformative impact on the environment, now asking, after doing so much damage, can we change nature? This time to save it? In The Sixth Extinction, she explored the ways in which our capacity for destruction has reshaped the natural world. Now she examines how the very sorts of interventions that have imperiled our planet are increasingly seen as the only hope for its salvation. By turns inspiring, terrifying, and darkly comedic, Under a White Sky is an utterly original examination of the challenges that we face. Joining Kolbert in conversation this evening is Bill McKibben. He's a contributing writer to The New Yorker, a founder of the grassroots climate campaign 350.org, and the Schumann Distinguished Professor in Residence at Middlebury College in Vermont. He was a 2014 recipient of the Right Livelihood Prize, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel, and the Gandhi Peace Award. He's written over a dozen books about the environment, including his most recent, Falter, Has the Human Game Begun to Play Itself Out? So this evening's event will also include an audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A bottom at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone has asked a question you'd particularly like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. And perhaps most importantly, please do consider supporting Elizabeth and Powell's by purchasing a copy of her new book from us. A link to buy Under the White Sky will be shared in the chat a couple of times this evening. Elizabeth, Bill, it's such a pleasure to welcome you. Thank you both for joining us tonight.
Well, it's enormous fun to be there. Betsy, you wanted to start. You get us going, and then we'll join in conversation. But just to say, on day one, congratulations on a truly, truly important book.
Oh, thank you, Bill. I want to start by saying a couple things. And I have a book here, my first edition copy of Bill's book from 1989. And there's sort of a line in among writers who write about what we will call the natural world. We can talk about that for lack of a better term. And it's sort of writers before Bill's book at the end of Nature came out and afterwards. It's sort of like the iridium layer that marks, the transition from the from the Cretaceous into the Tertiary. How's that? And it had a tremendous influence on me, and I know on a lot of other writers and a lot of other non-writers. How's that? And so I'm incredibly pleased and grateful to Bill for being here tonight. And I thought, in the spirit of a non-reading here, a Zoom reading, I just would read a little bit to sort of set the stage for our conversation from the beginning of the book. It's not the very beginning of the book. At the very beginning of the book, just to sort of set the stage, I am traveling down the Chicago River into something called the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, which was built. The canal was built to reverse the Chicago River. And now, for somewhat complicated reason, it has been electrified. And so that's the first scene in the book. And then I'm just going to read very briefly from the next section, and then Bill and I will chat. Okay. That man should have dominion over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth is a prophecy that is hardened into fact. Choose just about any metric you want, and it tells the same story. People have by now directly transformed more than half the ice-free land on Earth, some 27 million square miles, and indirectly half of what remains. We have dammed or diverted most of the world's major rivers. Our fertilizer plants and legume crops fix more nitrogen than all terrestrial ecosystems combined, and our planes, cars, and power stations emit about 100 times more carbon dioxide than volcanoes do. We now routinely cause earthquakes. A particularly damaging human-induced quake that shook Pawnee, Oklahoma on the morning of September 3rd, 2016 was felt all the way in Des Moines. In terms of sheer biomass, the numbers are stark staring. People today outweigh wild mammals by a ratio of more than 8-to-1. Add in the weight of our domesticated animals, mostly cows and pigs, and that ratio climbs to 22-to-1. In fact, as a recent paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences observed, humans and livestock outweigh all vertebrates combined, with the exception of fish. We have become a major driver of extinction and also probably of speciation. So pervasive is man's impact, it's said we live in a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. In the age of man, there is nowhere to go, and this includes the deepest trenches of the oceans and the middle of the Antarctic ice sheet that does not already bear our Friday-like footprints. An obvious lesson to draw from this turn of events is be careful what you wish for. Atmospheric warming, ocean acidification, sea level rise, deglaciation, desertification, eutrophication. These are just some of the byproducts of our species' success. Such is the pace of what is blandly labeled global change, that there are only a handful of comparable examples in Earth's history, the most recent being the asteroid impact that ended the reign of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. Humans are producing no analog climates, no analog ecosystems, a whole no analog future. At this point, it might be prudent to scale back our commitments and reduce our impacts, but there are so many of us, and we are stepped in so far, return seems impracticable. And so we face a no analog predicament. If there is to be an answer to the problem of control, it's going to be more control. Only now, what's got to be managed is not a nature that exists or is imagined to exist apart from the human. Instead, the new effort begins with a planet remade and spirals back on itself, not so much the control of nature as the control of nature. First, you reverse a river, then you electrify it.
Yeah, that is a powerful passage and a powerful essay. And I want to just begin by saying that the whole book is really, really remarkable. I'd read some of these pieces before the book came out, some of them in the New Yorker or elsewhere, but their cumulative impact was really, really powerful. The writer, in one sense, that they call to mind just because of the scale of the reporting that you've been doing, and because you cross his tracks once or twice, is John McPhee. But it's written with, but where those are wonderful pieces because they allow you to escape for the most part into the contemplation of the past or things. These are desperately urgent on the questions that will define what this planet looks like by the time this century has come to an end. So let's just take a step back for a minute and just, because it's all very heavy stuff, and just take a breath and say welcome to all the people who are joining us here. On the one hand, I mean, there's something poignant about doing this, I got to say, Betsy, because both you and I have been to Powell's many times to read, and it seems very odd to be doing it over Zoom. There's no chance to walk around the corner to the Deschutes Brewery and have dinner, or stop by the food trucks, and no big beautiful wall of books behind us is stretching off into the distance and all those things. On the other hand, it's pretty nice. I mean, I was just looking at the chat, and we've got people joining in from Hong Kong and from Recife in Brazil, and from every corner of the United States and Canada, and that we couldn't do. And in fact, that's precisely what we should be doing. with this book because it's so very much about the biggest, widest scale of things. We'll talk about some of the particular pieces in a minute, but it strikes me that the underlying question here that you began to address in the section that you read is, given the given the predicaments that we've wandered into, above all, the way that we're wrecking the climate system of the planet in real time, and seeing in real time the effects of that, it seems like in the largest sense, human beings have two options. One is to figure out how to get radically smaller quickly. And, that's the path of learning to be far more, conserve, be more efficient, put up solar panels and wind turbines to take advantage of the most benign things around us. And the other option is to get much bigger as a species and figure out how to wrest control of the most basic operations of the earth around us. And um, I think that probably one sense of those things is shifting over time, as you would expect, the deeper we get into these crises. Talk about how it's shifted for you over time, if it has.
Well, I mean, the end of the book, the last few chapters deal very explicitly with climate change, although climate change is definitely throughout the book an issue. And so in one chapter, I go to visit these scientists in Australia who are working on something that has been dubbed the Super Coral Project. And the idea behind that is, very simply, we've warmed the oceans, we're acidifying the oceans. It's another product of pouring a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so that's one intervention. You can call it the control of nature. You can call it, as you suggested, sort of just sleepwalking into hugely altering and manipulating nature. And the idea behind the Super Coral Project was, well, coral is one group of organisms that really doesn't like this warming waters, is corals, reef building corals, these tiny animals that build reefs. And so these scientists are working on what has been dubbed assisted evolution. And it's essentially, can you sort of crossbreed corals from either different parts of the reef or maybe even hybridize different species and find hardier varieties that could then potentially, repopulate the Great Barrier Reef, which has lost something like 50% of its corals over the last 30 years. So that's actually sort of the story that got me involved in this whole project. And when I first went out there, when I first heard about it, I thought, this is kind of, nuts, I guess. Humans are never gonna be able to reproduce what the reef can reproduce. And I think that is, that's a very, very real, possibility that humans will never be able to do that. But when you're in Australia talking to people who run the, Great Barrier Reef Marine Protection Authority, or whatever it's called, it goes by the wonderful acronym GBRUMPA, they will tell you, if we want to have a reef, we're going to have to do these, manipulations. We're going to have to try to shade the reef. I mean, they were talking about all sorts of, robotically reseeding the reefs. It seemed science fictiony, but they may be right. That may be what you have to do to try to get some portion of the reef through this tremendously difficult time. And the statement that one of the scientists made to me, which I thought was very powerful, is, she said something like, some people just want to go back, the reef as it was, and we're not getting back the reef as it was. That's just not happening in the foreseeable future. So I think that these questions, which are really the most profound of our time, are very hard to answer. And even if your initial response is, that's just, crazy, that's never going to work, and we really just need to scale back, you're left with this problem of, even if we did, what's going to happen to the coral reefs, just to name one example.
You have a line that any writer would like to have written when you say that perhaps the best one can hope for is the okay barrier reef into the future. Personally, having spent a lot of time on that reef and with a lot of scientists down there, that part seems to me impossible. It really does. Just the sense of scale is so great. But that brings us to the last third of this book, which is about geoengineering the climate. I mean, instead of trying to put a sail over the part of the Great Barrier Reef, and so if you could bring the temperature of the planet back to what it was 30 years ago or 40 years ago, maybe you could save the Great Barrier Reef and keep the rest of the Arctic from melting, and on and on and on down a long list. Geoengineering is just emerging. It's not like, even when I was writing The End of Nature, I was describing these schemes that people had, aerosols in the atmosphere or floating styrofoam chips on the ocean to reflect sunlight out to space or whatever. But we do seem to be reaching a moment when suddenly it's kind of breaking through into the public that there's a real possibility of this. Some of the people that you mentioned at Harvard have applied for recently for the right to start testing this stuff out in Sweden, and there's a big controversy underway about whether to let them do it or not. It's clearly one of the most important questions that we're going to decide in the course of the 21st century. So lay it out a little bit for us. What actually is possible, and how did you end up thinking about those possibilities by the end?
Well, that's a very good question. There's sort of two chapters of the book that deal with what is sort of lumped together as geoengineering, but which probably should be teased out and will sort of over time are coming apart. And one is this idea or technology or whatever you want to call it of carbon dioxide removal, right? So, the very unfortunate thing about carbon dioxide, one of the many unfortunate properties is it hangs around for a long time. So even at the point which, we don't know exactly when it will be, we can be hopeful that we will reach, net zero at some time in the, just beyond the horizon, let's put it that way. At that point, you still have a lot of carbon hanging around, and it's still doing a lot of damage. And so a lot of people, this is, and built into a lot of the IPCC scenarios, and I don't want to take them more seriously than they deserve to be taken, but all of those projections, all of the scenarios for holding climate change to 1.5 degrees contain what are called negative emissions, and most of the 2-degree scenarios do too. It's in the fine print, but it's emerging into consciousness. And so there are a lot of people, a lot of entrepreneurs, and a lot of people looking for ways that we could suck carbon out of the atmosphere, either using machines or using trees. And the interesting thing about trees is trees take up, CO2 while they grow, but then they rot. So you kind of have to do something with the tree. So there are all sorts of ideas, once again, possibly visionary, possibly wacky, that people are looking at to suck CO2 out of the air. So that's
that's one category. Right. That has the difficulty of being cumbersome and expensive.
Yes.
The other half has either the difficulty or the or perhaps the it's either a blessing or it's a curse of being not technically perhaps difficult and not all that expensive. So explain.
Right. So that's the idea of solar geoengineering, and the biggest group looking into this, or the sort of most far along, as you mentioned, is a group at Harvard, the Harvard Solar Geoengineering Research Program. And the idea behind solar geoengineering is that we've already mucked around with the atmosphere, dumped a lot of CO2 into it. That was a big mistake. You can't get it out fast, as we've discussed, and it will continue to warm the Earth for a long time. And if you get to the point that you really don't like the climate, which is unfortunately quite possible that we will, reach, even, even despite our best efforts, or if we don't really make our best efforts like that, both of which, remain to be seen. If we're unlucky, there's a huge error bars in climate projections. So if they are on the high end, anyway, you get to a point, and who knows, there's no, fixed point, but where there's really a calamity, a humanitarian calamity potentially, and people say we've got to do something about the climate fast. The only thing that scientists have come up with, even in theory, and I think it is still very much, in theoretical prospect, is you throw up a lot of something, sulfur dioxide, calcium carbonate, very small particles that reflect sunlight back to space. You throw them into the stratosphere. You do that with a fleet of specially designed aircraft. And that would be mimicking a volcano. After a big volcanic eruption, you get a temporary cooling of the Earth owing to all the sulfur dioxide that gets poured into the stratosphere. Now, this has been described as a broad highway to hell, and also has been described as inevitable, and whether either of those is correct or not, I don't I don't take that on. I think it's hovering out there. It's been hovering out there since we discovered climate change. The very first report, LBJ in 1965, said, oh, didn't mention cutting back on fossil fuels, just said, let's just put some reflective stuff in the oceans, which is kind of stunning. Is this an invitation to World War III? There are so many unanswered questions. And one of the unanswered questions, I should say, the very fundamental unanswered question, and that gets to your point about, doing some experimental work in Sweden, is this even theoretically possible? And scientists who are studying it and who are interested in it would say, well, we ought to find that out. We ought to do some experiments, because we might, if we need it, we ought to know whether it's even possible. And other scientists, many other scientists, would say that's bad. That's, the proverbial camel's nose under the tent. You're just going to do this experimentation preparatory to, getting us all used to the idea of shooting a lot of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. And that, I think, as you suggest, is going to play out more and more as we see impacts of climate change that we really don't like.
One of the curious things about it is that it could be an excuse to keep burning fossil fuel forever, and so Exxon might like it. On the other hand, one could see how the people of the Marshall Islands might decide that this was the only option they had for keeping the ocean at bay, and there's at least some reason to believe that it's technologically simple enough that a small group of nations, or in our world, one guy who made a lot of money, selling stuff out of a warehouse in Seattle, and now has his fleet of rocket ships, might decide to do it on his own. These seem problematic, to say the least, and also philosophically problematic. Explain the, I mean, this is where your title comes from. Explain a little bit where that comes from.
Right. So there are many, I mean, this is a huge, area of scientific inquiry and debate already, and destined to become huger. But people who have looked, it has a lot of potential side effects. One of the very most serious is potentially changing, regional weather patterns, altering monsoon patterns, which I should say, in fairness to those who are studying, geoengineering, we're already doing. We're already altering monsoon patterns. So these questions become very complicated, like which is worse, what we're already doing, or if you overlaid some form of cooling on top of the warming, you might get weird patterns. They might not necessarily be, quote unquote, worse. But another potential side effect is if you put enough of this stuff up there, you are changing, you're literally changing how much direct sunlight is hitting the Earth. And calculations that people have done suggest that the appearance of the sky would change. It would become whiter. So even if you were out, in a very unpolluted part of the world, and we're on a sunny day, you'd expect to see a very blue sky. The sky would kind of have a milky tinge, and that's where the title comes from, under a white sky.
Which is a lot to think about.
Yes, and I think that your point, I mean, I don't know if maybe some people in the audience have read, Kim Stanley Robinson's recent book, The Ministry for the Future, which begins with India having, temporarily, this is another point that people make who are interested in this technology and who would argue, it may be better than not to do it. How's that? As a bridge between now and some moment when when we have brought carbon emissions down to zero, and where we have figured out, how to get to net zero, which would also involve potentially a fair amount of carbon dioxide removal. There's a time period in there where the system has a lot of inertia, and you're still getting more and more warming. Could you use some form of geoengineering as sort of a bridge? And other people, argue, well, it's that kind of thinking. It's that kind of thinking precisely that got us to where we are today. But as you're suggesting, Bill, there are potentially some pretty, I don't think this is, I do want to say, I don't think this is happening tomorrow. I don't think it's happening a decade from now. I think this conversation, though, is going to go on until maybe it does happen. How's that? And there are potentially some, as it were, strange bedfellows. There are low-lying island nations and, ExxonMobil, who rarely see eye to eye about anything, but potentially could on something like this.
I was very glad you mentioned Kim Stanley Robinson's new book. It's called Ministry for the Future. I think they may actually have just put a link to it and it is a extremely important novel. In a certain way, I mean, you've done better job than anybody else of thinking about these things in nonfiction terms, but there's a element of them that you can only think about in kind of fictional terms and let sort of play out in those ways. And I couldn't recommend that book more. I think it's really essential and a perfect companion to Under a White Sky.
Yeah, he and I actually did a Climate One podcast the other day. It was really interesting to talk to him, and he has such a unusual take on things. And as you say, some of these things you can only think through on some level by putting yourself into the future, the not very distant future, but the future.
In our particular Zoom moment on the planet, someone in the chat notes that you in fact can listen to Kim talking at an hour and a half hence at Point Reyes Books tonight, and there's a link. There's a link in the chat, so you can just go straight from this conversation to that one, and rightly so. Yeah, I mean, I'm very glad that you're raising this question with this depth of reporting around it. And one of the things that Robinson book makes clear, and that you make clear too, is that one of the hardest parts of even thinking about it is thinking about how you'd ever make a decision about it. What would, and which is why it worries me that it's just going to be some Jeff Bezos figure at some point who just decides that he's going to go ahead and do it.
Well, Kim Stanley Robinson and I did have a chat about this part, and I think that, I do think that one danger, if there's one, I'm not one to say that dangers have been overstated, how's that? But I do think that one's slightly overstated because, these would be, very you'd have to run many, many flights of very large aircraft to do this. And if the US Air Force or the Russian Air Force or the Chinese Air Force decided they didn't care for this, I don't think it would happen, you know? So I think it has to be sanctioned by the major powers of the world. How's that? Now, that doesn't mean it has to be sanctioned by the whole world, but it has to be sanctioned by anyone who can shoot down a stratospheric, plane in the stratosphere.
I'm going to go to questions in the Q&A in a minute, but I do think that one thing, I mean, timing is really important here. These guys have been carrying on this, in some ways, same conversation about geoengineering for a long time, decades in a sense. What's happened in the last 5 or 10 years is, both increases and decreases. It seems to me the case for this kind of work. On the one hand, it's clear that we're much nearer the edge in some ways than we'd imagined, and we're seeing huge effects of climate change sooner than we thought. On the other hand, the other engineers hard at work on solar power and wind power and things, have done an unbelievable job in the last decade. The price of this stuff's come down 90%. We're at the point where if we really wanted to, we could make an astonishing push over the next decade as a planet to radically transform our energy system. And it would be a shame, it seems to me, to let ideas like this get in the way of making that effort, even if it's going to be a final effort to see if we can actually do it in the next decade.
Well, I do want to speak on behalf of these guys at Harvard who are very smart guys, and
yes.
You may disagree with them, and that is absolutely, everyone's, I'm not advocating for them, but I would just want to give them their due and say they would be the first person to say you're right.
Yeah, no,
that is what we have to be doing. And the question is, there are two questions. A, are we going to do it? That's a question. And B, are there, where is the climate system? There's just, as this gets back to the question of sort of error bars. If you're unlucky on those error bars, even with your best efforts, you might find that there are consequences that you really don't want to accept if there are any other alternatives. I hope to make it clear that I am a reporter. I'm reporting this. I do not think the conversation should be turning to geoengineering, and geoengineering sort of comes at the end of the book.
Yep.
On top of all these other schemes,
yep.
Which you might say, well, that makes sense, and that makes sense, and that makes sense, and then you get to this, and then you might go, yeah.
Somebody has a good question in this that it sets up something that you talk about a little bit. And I just, before we get off the geoengineering topic, I want to bring it up just so people are aware. As you point out, one of the things that doesn't happen when you change the composition of the atmosphere in this way is anything to do with ocean acidification, which you were one of the very first people to be writing about the fact that this is just the evil twin of temperature increase. And even if burning fossil fuel was doing nothing to the temperature, we'd have to stop doing it probably because of what it's doing to the chemistry of the oceans. Do people have plans? Are there similar scale plans for figuring out how you might somehow keep the oceans from dramatically acidifying?
Well, I do mention a couple in passing in the book, but they require the oceans are so huge, and they require such, you could dump a lot of, lime in the ocean, but it takes a lot of energy to make lime. And so you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot, as it were. And the scale involved, if you just do a kind of back of the envelope calculation of what you're talking about to try to counter our carbon emissions, is so huge as to pretty quickly become ridiculous. But people do talk about, grinding up certain kinds of rocks that have certain properties, olivine, and that would suck more CO2 into the ocean, but also have the happy side effect of neutralizing some of the CO2. And I can't get into the chemistry of that because I'm not an expert on that. But these ideas are floating out there, but they all
Yep.
suffer from the same problem, which is scale.
Yeah, I think and actually this question of scale strikes me as important in answering one of the questions that people are most interested in on the question chat. Um, Someone says, Katie says, what are your thoughts on animal agriculture and its impact on climate change? Do you think environmentalists should be taking a more solid approach to de-escalate the mass production of greenhouse gases by animal agriculture? And that's a fascinating question. And part of the answer bears on this question of scale, it seems to me too.
Yeah, I mean, animal agriculture is, as everyone knows, it's a significant portion of our greenhouse gas emissions. It's not the majority. Even if you were once again to eliminate animal agriculture, you would still have a big CO2 problem. I do think it's important to point that out, just because the numbers are the numbers. How's that? But it's significant. It is significant. And how we farm, and cows burping, it sounds absurd, but there's a lot of methane in there, and methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. So here we once again, we are searching for workarounds. I guess it could have been a chapter in the book, even, creating either genetically gene editing or finding some ways to produce cows that don't burp methane. How's that? That could be our next trick. But yes, we should certainly be focusing on, I want to say, up and down the agricultural system, which is a big source of greenhouse gas emissions.
It's right. And just on the scale question, I think that one way to think about it is, I mean, it seems to me it's very important for people to figure out how to eat lower on the food chain, and that makes a lot of sense. But that one shouldn't expect it to be a silver bullet answer. One of the reasons I think that climate campaigners focus their attention a lot on fossil fuels, I'll just speak for myself since I do a certain amount of this climate campaigning from time to time, is not just that it's the biggest part of the problem, 60 or 70% or whatever of the emissions, but that though these companies that are responsible for it are enormous and hence powerful and hard to beat, they're also a manageable target set. There's 24 of them that you have to beat in order, and changing of farming practices, which could actually be quite an effective way of figuring out how to sequester more carbon out of the atmosphere. It's difficult because we have 1 billion farmers on the planet, and cultural practices and things are deeply ingrained, and it's difficult to necessarily make. Doesn't mean one shouldn't try, but and I'm very glad that we're talking a lot more about regenerative agriculture and so on. But it is hard. One of the things I think that becomes clear when you read this book of yours and understand the scale of the issues we're dealing with on almost all these things is the difficulty of individual solutions alone managing to exert really fundamental pressure. And I think we got a good sense of that this past year during COVID. I mean, everybody changed everything. Everybody stayed home, no one got in an airplane, whatever, and carbon emissions went down about 10%, which isn't nothing, it's not bad, but it really did seem to indicate that that most of the problem is located deep in the guts of our various systems, and you're going to have to kind of rip out the guts to get at a lot of what's going on here.
Well, I think COVID is unfortunately, I think COVID is like the perfect metaphor, and it really cut across, this book. And the last bit, I was literally talking to the, Harvard guys about solar geoengineering as COVID was closing the campus.
Right.
It seems like a really classic example of how we deal with the world. It was totally a case where, this is a quote unquote natural phenomenon, right? Viruses jump species. But the way that we handle the way that we deal with animals, right, domesticated and wild, was an invitation, to a pandemic. We've known that for decades. Once again, you can read many good books on that. Then when we got a virus that made the jump and that we knew was very dangerous, we quickly rushed around the world. It went global in about 2 days, basically. And then even then we had sort of an opportunity to, minimize the damage. We let it get completely out of control. Here we are, all sitting at home because of that. And now we're waiting for the great techno fix of the vaccine, which is using cutting edge technology. These mRNA vaccines are cutting edge. And we're hoping that's going to save us. And now increasingly we're worried that it's not, because this virus is mutating very fast. So it's sort of a perfect parable of how we approach these situations.
Yeah, and that's emotionally laden for everybody, because everybody's scared and everybody's tired and everybody's everything else. Several people in the question area are asking how you deal with climate grief. And you've been dealing with this a long time, thinking about these questions. How obviously one of the ways that you deal with it is go out and learn and report back to the rest of us about what's going on. But there's a burden of knowing too much too, and there must be nights when you find yourself pondering these things deep into the night. How do you kind of just emotionally deal with where we are right now?
Well, I'm gonna turn that on you, Bill. But I will say that I'm an insomniac, so I've always been insomniac. So I stay up late nights every night and worry. So I am very much in the worrying mode. But writing this book, which was actually a lot of fun, and it sounds perverse, but it was really a lot of fun, and I met a lot of fascinating people. I went to fascinating places. Including the Great Barrier Reef. That I suppose my own form of therapy or dealing with it. That's definitely part of it. We live unfortunately in interesting times, and as a journalist, one is very fortunate to be able to, in addition to worry, also take advantage, as it were, of how interesting all of this stuff is. But I'm going to turn that back on you, because you've been thinking about this even longer than I have. And how do you deal with it?
Well, my standard, I mean, when I get if I find myself getting too depressed about things or grieving things, I just decide to get angry instead. And there are days when I just wake up and think, well, I have no idea whether we can actually solve the climate crisis, but at least we can make life hard for Exxon. And today that will have to be enough, to get one through the
the difficult days. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, everyone has their way, their coping mechanisms. Yeah.
And right at the moment, I got to say, we're having this conversation. We should acknowledge that we're in at least a 2 or 3 week period when it feels more okay to feel optimistic about any of this stuff than it has for a very long time. At the very least, the people who run our government seem committed to trying, and which is a novel experience, at least for Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with them. I give them very high marks for the first 2 weeks of the administration. It's been very impressive.
There are let me see here. Well, there's a bunch of questions, good questions about communications. Um, um, how do you, uh, an important one from a teacher, middle school science teacher. Lynn, thank you. Um, how do you inspire kids to action? How do you make them think that their everyday choices make a difference? Um, they've grown up with a lot of gloom and doom. On the other hand, we're living in the Greta Thunberg age too, when there were tons of young people who seem to have seized, on the idea that they might actually be able to make a difference. Um, you have kids, you're in a college town. Um, how do you sense what's happening right now with young people?
Well, I think, and this is based on a very um, sort of biased sample, I suppose, of my own, children and students that I encounter who obviously, in some level, want to engage this issue. I think young people are very torn. On the one hand, they're angry and upset, and on the other hand, I do think that they, especially in this past election, where a lot of young people turned out and where there were a lot of efforts to bring young people out precisely around climate change. This is your issue. Let's organize around this and let's see some results. And, thank God they did see some results. And so, I think that is a big force behind the push we're seeing in the White House now, is young people really not letting them down for ethical and political reasons, that they became a potent political force. So I think it is really important that people, and one thing I'll tell you, one thing that worries me, as a parent and as a human, is we live in a culture that's where attention is so valuable and so divided. you know it's not enough in politics, as no one knows better than you, Bill. It's not enough to win one election, and it's not enough to, you can never sit back. You have to be thinking about the next election and the next one. And it's an endless fight over issues like this. There's not a single battle that you don't have to fight. And so I hope that the attention is there, and the time, because it's going to be a long battle. It's never going to be won.
Amen. Absolutely right. I do think that actually at this point, young people are leading, and a huge shout out, among other things, to the Sunrise Movement. I think that one of the reasons politics in DC is better on this right now, maybe the single biggest reason, is their effectiveness over the last few years in really, really pushing hard and effectively and beautifully. I'm actually, much of the work I want to do in the next while is see if we can get older Americans, like old people like me, to um, engage in this work as effectively and worry as much about the legacy that we're leaving behind as young people are worrying about the future they're inheriting. And I hope we can. Let's go back to the book, because there's a good question here from Australia that allows you to delve into one of the places that we haven't talked about. And whoever's writing from Melbourne says, after first politely apologizing for their government, that's all right. You don't have to apologize to Americans. We've just been through 4 years. I'm afraid we're going to be apologizing for a long time. But as he points out, or she points out, um, uh, Australia has a long history of thinking that they're solving a problem only to create a much worse one. You tell the story of the cane toad in the book, and maybe you can tell it a little bit here, but as a way of going into this fascinating discussion that you have about genetic possibilities of genetic engineering. If geoengineering is changing the world at the absolute largest possible scale, CRISPR is about changing it at the absolute possible smallest scale, and yet in certain ways they raise many of the same questions, it seems to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And the idea that, we try to solve problems and end up making them worse, I want to assure our listener from Australia that uh, that's very much a theme of the book. And one of the chapters takes me to a facility not far from Melbourne in Geelong, where scientists are working to genetically edit cane toads, which were, for non-Australians in our audience, brought to Australia from, they're native to Central America and South America. They were exported all around the world under this mistaken idea, unfortunately, that they were going to help control the beetles that eat sugarcane. So they were brought to Australia in the 30s to the northeast coast. They've spread everywhere, not everywhere, but all sort of circumnavigated the country. They're still spreading, they continue to spread, and they're highly toxic. So they've caused a lot of native wildlife to crash. The native wildlife eats them. They have no toads in Australia, so there's no toad, wariness. Everything eats them, and then they die because these toads are so toxic. So scientists in Australia have succeeded in sort of breaking the toxicity gene, the gene that makes them so toxic. And that's a really interesting, breakthrough. You could raise cane toads that are less toxic than wild cane toads, much less toxic, using gene editing. And the question of, what you should do with these toads, should you be allowed to let them out into the world? You could equip them with something called gene drive, which is another very, cutting edge technology based on CRISPR, which would push out this genetic change into the wild population. So all of these are huge questions that hang over. A lot of conservation efforts would benefit from being able to use gene editing. If you could find a gene that conferred heat resistance in corals and you could push out that gene, in theory, once again, in theory, you could have a big impact. You could potentially save some reefs. Do we want to go that route? These are huge questions that, unfortunately, as I say, I think we're only going to come up against more and more of these questions.
There are, as is always the case, as you know from public speaking, there are a bunch of questions around population in the question box. I will just say, when it comes to, I'll let you answer, but I'll just say, when it comes at least to climate change, population is not really the driving factor most of the time, growth in population, because most of it's coming in places where people use very, very little energy. And in fact, what's interesting to me about population is it seems the one place where we've actually taken a low-tech solution and really made it work. That 30 or 40 years ago, the average woman on this planet had 5 or 6 children, nearly 6 children. And now that number is 2.3. And basically the way that people did it was that developing countries figured out that if you educated and empowered women to one degree or another, it turned out most of them didn't want to have 6 children and would. And so the population is still increasing, but the expectation is it will actually level off by mid-century, and that may start to give us some breathing room. And that's an interesting notion, it seems to me, that the lowest tech solution, getting girls in school, liberating them to one degree or another, has had an effect on the same scale that, the kind of incredible technological interventions that you're describing as possibilities have had. It's one of the things that gives me heart sometimes. How do you come to think about population stuff?
Well, I think population, there's that famous equation of, human impacts, IPAT or whatever it was that was devised, many years ago by, among others, Barack Obama's scientific advisor, John Holdren. And it was just basically, human impacts on the world are population times, consumption, basically. And so, there are parts of the world that are very, have low population, even negative population growth, that are high consuming, and so have a huge impact. And there are parts of the world where the population is still growing, and those, as you say, tend to be very low consuming. But I just do want to say that we don't want them always to be low consuming. And so that does get to another question, which I also, gives back to us a little bit about to like agriculture, meat consumption. Yes, some people are already eating really low on the food chain. Do we want to consign them? Do we want to say, well, you always have to eat, so these are humongous questions, but I do think they all converge on this idea that, potentially this century, the 21st century, may well be if we're lucky, it will be the point of maximum human impacts on the planet. And Ed Wilson has this essay, which I really recommend. It's called, I think it's called The Bottleneck. And it's about getting things, how can we get as many species, as many natural systems through this point of potentially maximum human impacts. And that is kind of, once again, you can disagree with it. You can say, the Super Curl project or some of these gene editing projects are that the cure is worse than the disease. And you may well be right. But those people are motivated. People looking at those projects are motivated by that idea. What can we get through this bottleneck? And, yes, human population will probably even, barring calamity, just through sort of demographic shift, by the end of the century should be declining, or should be at least have leveled off at a pretty high level, I have to say. We're talking 10 billion people. But what can we get through this period of maximum human impacts? And that is really the question. And even when we look at, sort of climate change solutions, we have to acknowledge that some of these are going to have big impacts too. They're going to have big land use components. And so for other species, this is a terrible century, and how many of them can get through it?
Well, that's a very smart place for us to be wrapping up. And I think that for me, this has been a really fruitful discussion, because it's solidified in my mind a couple of these, the possibility that we may have to both simultaneously get bigger and get smaller in our powers and impacts on the planet. And that's a very hard thing to pull off politically, and so on. And who knows whether we can do it, but clearly these are the questions that we have to answer. And so I will just, we've done a good job of explaining why consuming is not the thing we should be doing the most of necessarily, but this is a book that you need to have and on your shelf and able to refer to think about. It's one of that fairly small number of books that is really important in figuring out what we do. And the opportunity to get to buy it from a great independent bookstore like Powell's is makes it all the happier. And so I'm really grateful to everybody who joined us tonight. We've had a big crowd, bigger than we actually could have fit inside the bookstore. And it's been, as always, just the most fun to get to listen to you, Betsy. You're one of maybe the crucial tour guide to the planet that we all share. And we're extraordinarily grateful for the good work that you do. So we'll see you soon, and many, many thanks.
Well, I before I let everyone go, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank you, Bill, because no one has done more to bring these issues to the top of the public's mind than you have. And I really want to thank you, and I want to thank Powell's, and I want to thank everyone from all around the world who came to listen tonight. So thank you.
Amen.
Well, thank you both so much, Elizabeth, Bill. That was amazing. It was wonderful to hear that. I know I got a lot out of that. I just want to Add to the thanks. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Please do consider purchasing a copy of Elizabeth's new book by visiting us at powells.com and check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events. We look forward to seeing you at another one soon. This event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel along with our other previous events. Have a wonderful night.
Take care, and congratulations on the book, Betsy. It really is
Thank
something.
you, Bill. Thank you. Ciao,
Night
ciao.
all.